Well, I'd be lying if I said this wasn't disappointing. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, ladies and gentlemen. Nick Banks for all things PlayStation 4 with a review today on The Last Guardian. So, after 10 long years, The Last Guardian is finally sitting on the shelves of our video game stores, but unlike Final Fantasy 15, a lot of reports say that The Last Guardian was in development for 10 years, but in actual fact, it was in development limbo for about 2 or 3 of those years, just sat in a digital filing cabinet gathering digital dust. And there are scars in the game that show, as a result of that and the other development woes that The Last Guardian had suffered throughout that decade. Is it worth you spending your money on? That is the ultimate question. And the answer will be yes for some people, and the answer will be no for others. It really does depend on your gaming preferences and whether or not these scars within the game will affect you as a gamer, and whether or not ultimately you will like this thing. However, an aspect of this game that everybody is likely to enjoy is Trico himself. He is really the star of the show, and it's blatantly obvious that a majority of developer resources were poured into Trico, which can be a shame because there are other aspects of the game that could have done with a little bit more attention. But when you're running around with Trico and you can see how well he's been designed, he's a very practical, believable beast. And we all love dogs, right? Well, Trico is just like a giant flying dog. And he's got a lot of pet-like qualities to him. And it's these giant pet-like qualities that will have you likely speaking to Trico, even though he's just an animated object on your screen. And you have to stop and think for a moment that it is actually quite interesting that you would feel inspired to speak to him at all. I mean, I know I did, although sadly most of the time it was go over there, you stupid animal, no, that would, no, go over that way, no, 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 now jump, and so on and so forth. But like I said, Trico is, regardless of all of that, a very endearing creature. He gets really excited in wide open outdoor spaces, hopping about gleefully. Maybe he'll have a hissy fit after fighting off foes, only to calm down after you've climbed on his back and stroked the back of his head, if you can control the boy to get to the back of his head, that is. Something we'll get into later on. Perhaps he'll see something that he doesn't like the look of and growl and hiss at it, and all the different noises and the motions and behaviors that Trico goes through makes him a very believable animal, and therefore the developers have been extremely successful in that aspect of the game, in that Trico is a practical, believable, and even lovable animal. And while it's not entirely necessary to understand the different squeals and barks and hisses and sounds that Trico makes to figure out the puzzles, it does generally help because 90% of the puzzles in the game revolve around appeasing Trico in order to make him happy to move forward and to move on through the game. With that said, I think a lot of us saw it coming a mile away. Developing a game where the AI character leads the story and leads you through the environments is a gamble, is very risky because AI is still very shaky, and the AI on Trico, it's passable, but sometimes it will drive you mental. A particular diving scene in a deep pool springs to mind, where there's no down command for Trico, and this is where controls issues come into play, in that you want him to dive, you know that's where you have to go, and there is no go down there button, there is only a jump button, an elevate button. So little moments like that, you really do have to lean back onto the AI system that has been designed for Trico, and sadly, more often than not, it will let you down and it will frustrate you. And there have been a lot of articles out there saying, oh, Trico is an animal with his own mind, he's not going to do what you tell him whenever you want. But frankly, I'm seeing that as a get out clause for what is really quite shaky AI. I'm sure many of you will remember that E3 footage that came out a couple of years back, that big action scene of Trico struggling to run across that wooden gantry and saving the boy as he falls. That is actually one of the few moments in the game that functions just fine. The camera behaves itself. Obviously, you're still fighting with the controls, but again, I'm going to come on to that in a moment. And everything just works. And in these set-piece action scenes, it feels a lot like the camera was designed in such a way to favour those moments within the game. And when you've got tighter spaces or moments that require more refined movement or camera control, this zoomed out cinematic favouring camera doing whatever it wants, it just doesn't work in those areas. And I do feel like the developers maybe should have thought about another way of coming in on camera control on this game. More often than not, you are fighting against a camera that is doing whatever the heck it wants to do, be it turning annoyingly into a wall, and this is with your thumb off the right stick completely. Or if you're on the back of Trico and you're going down a narrow corridor, the camera will just come down and down and down and down until all you've got is Trico's arse in your face. And to add insult to injury, it's almost as if the developers were aware of this issue, and the only thing that they did about it, and this is terrible, is to create a blackout, a black screen. It will take seconds at a time sometimes, and while you've got this black screen, the system is obviously figuring out where to put the camera, and suddenly the screen will open up again and you'll have your game back, and sometimes it's for a split second. But again, it's very jarring, and this combination of fighting by gently massaging the right stick to get the camera where you want it, and the blackouts that happen every now and then, they just suck you out of the game. You wave goodbye to immersion, because having to deal with all of this, you won't feel invested in the game or the events that are going on, except of course for what I mentioned just now, these cinematic moments, of which there are only a few. Now, let's talk quickly about the graphics in this game. It's common knowledge by now that The Last Guardian was supposed to have released way back on the PlayStation 3, and now we have it on the PlayStation 4. Have all the little graphical elements within the game managed to keep up with industry competitors? Well, yes and no. I'll start off with the character models. Sometimes they look a little bit orangey yellow, kind of like Simpsons characters from the 90s, and the character models' clothes are always very bright. They're always glowing in some way, but thankfully it all gets a bit of a free pass because we know what to expect with the artistic style of Fumito Ueda's games, especially if you've played Ico or Ico, however you want to say it, or Shadow of the Colossus. We kind of know what to expect with what our characters are going to look like in these games. But when lighting does come into play, it has an oddly amplifying effect on everything that you're looking at. So you're going to have lighting effects spilling through windows, god rays coming through trees, or maybe you'll just have a big bright outdoors area. And it kind of has an interesting effect on foliage and Trico's feathers. And it just, as I say, amplifies everything, makes it look a lot more real. But then, most of the time you're not outside, you're going to be inside these temple areas, trying to figure out puzzles, at which point when there's no lighting effects, everything kind of has this dull, grey, lifeless effect to it. Which is a shame. One thing that is totally awesome about the game is actually the trees, and the foliage, and the moss on the walls. I know it sounds dumb, but these are actually the best trees I've ever seen in a game. Next to The Witcher 3's trees blowing around in the wind, and when the lighting spills onto these objects and these textures, it just looks magnificent. So we've got a bit of a binary thing going on here with the graphics. On one end, they're not so great. On the other end, they can look magnificent and the best in the industry. It's a tricky one. But we don't all rush out and buy a video game to look at how awesome its trees are, do we? Now, there's going to be a lot of people out there who have a burning question in their mind, people like me who have fond memories of Shadow of the Colossus, and they're going to want to know, is The Last Guardian as good as Shadow of the Colossus? Now, I'm not going to answer that question directly, but first let's just take a little history lesson. When Shadow of the Colossus released, we'd never seen anything like it. The size of your enemies was unprecedented in the history of gaming, and people were scratching their heads about how on earth this was made possible on a PlayStation 2 system. Now we've got The Last Guardian 2 generations later, and this wow factor, the limited gameplay and the selling factor of the wow factor that I'm talking about here with Shadow of the Colossus has been diminished massively, because since then we've had epics like God of War 3 or even Final Fantasy, or just take your pick, any other game on a massive scope like that is almost expected in this day and age with the games industry. So Fumito Ueda now faces an issue in that he can't rely anymore on making everything massive to sell a game. He can't make loads of massive beasties or loads of massive environments to wow his audience, because they've seen it all before. And something else that we've all experienced in the time between Shadow of the Colossus and now in all of our games is a smoother handling system. Our games handle much better, they're more user-friendly. But in the case of The Last Guardian, as soon as you start playing it, as soon as you start controlling the boy, the handling and the controls are going to feel very last generation. They would have been perfectly acceptable back then, but now they do feel a little bit jarring and clunky. So I guess you can say that controls can be bad in two ways. On the one hand, they can be badly mapped and just difficult to wrap your fingers around, and on the other, they can be well mapped, but they don't play out very well in the way your character is animated or the way that he moves around. And sadly, The Last Guardian is the latter of the two, and sometimes controlling this boy can feel like walking a fridge magnet through a factory of magnets. And Ueda's insistence on creating an anime-type character that moves like an anime-type character, just try running downhill, just see what he does. It's all gotten in the way of the finer moments in the game, the finer tuning things that are demanded in the controls, maybe balancing across a narrow plank of wood or things like that. And when the boy insists on hopping endlessly on the spot when enemies are about, it's just annoying. You just want him to stand still. On the brief moments when you're not moving, when enemies are about, it's nice to not be looking at someone jogging on the spot, you know? And like I said earlier on, after Trico's knocked down some of your enemies, he's very emotional, he gets very worked up and starts jumping about and screaming madly. And the only way to calm him down is to jump on and give him a little stroke. Now, it's a pain in the bum to actually climb onto his back, because obviously he's jumping you about and he's flinging you around like a straw man in a hurricane, and it's just made needlessly tricky. When you're on his back, then that allows enough stability to allow the animation of stroking him and calming him down. So even if you couldn't be bothered and you were just on his hind leg and you thought, oh, I'll just stroke him here to calm him down, it's not going to work, because it just flings you about all over the place. And this just adds to the frustration in the game, sadly. But I've ranted on about the things that frustrated me in this game enough. So what were its redeeming features? What was good about The Last Guardian? What was memorable? Well, if I'm being completely honest, there isn't a single moment in The Last Guardian that is as memorable as Shadow of the Colossus. Many of the boss fights in Shadow of the Colossus was memorable. I can still remember the combat music in my head now, because orchestrally that was one of the best orchestral efforts I've ever heard in a video game, and the music in Shadow of the Colossus really drove forward the drama, and that music is missing in The Last Guardian, sadly. But a lot of the interactions with Trico can be very poignant, and the few cutscenes in the game are very heavy-hitting. Because the story and the exposure of the story is so anemic, you are kept guessing so much. Whenever you are given a cutscene, it does hold your attention very well, because you want to know what the hell is going on. So there is still a bit of emotion and a bit of drama, but nowhere near as heavy-hitting as Shadow of the Colossus, so overall it's not as memorable. And look at this, I'm trying to talk about something good about the game and I've ended up talking negative about it. Ugh. It is still a game that I think every owner of a PlayStation 4 needs to play at some point, and that is mainly because it is just so damn unique. You will not play another game like this, probably ever, just in the way that you have to treat Trico as this finicky pet who will also be your salvation regardless of how frustrating he might be. So you've seen the footage, you've heard my opinions. Please bear in mind these are just the opinions of one man. If I have dashed your hopes against the wall, then by all means check out some other reviews. But from me, The Last Guardian is sadly going to be getting a 6 out of 10. For you, it may well be a 7. It depends on your preference as a gamer. But the overall disappointment and walking away from the game after having finished it, all these memories of frustration are just overriding all the poignant moments and the parts of the game that Ueda wanted you to remember. As painful as this was to deliver such a negative review, I hope you did enjoy it. I hope you found it informative. And if you did, then by all means click the subscribe button down there, share this with your friends, and leave me any comments. What did you think of The Last Guardian if you've played it already? This game is a pretty good one to open up a discussion on, so please let me know what you think. And until next time, this is Nick Banks for All Things PlayStation 4, signing off. See you on the next one, guys. Peace.